40 years ago, on July 23rd, 1982, something terrible happened during the filming of Twilight Zone, the movie. I'm saying the movie because, like most of you probably already know, Twilight Zone has a couple of series from back in 1959 all the way to 2019. And what we're going to be talking about in today's video is the movie from 1983. And like I was saying, something terrible happened when this movie was being filmed. To paint the picture, it was early in the morning, around 2:20 a.m., on an outdoor set in California, and a scene was being shot where actor Vic Morrow was supposed to carry two Vietnamese children across a river while a helicopter flew overhead as shooting and explosions went off all around. Now for context, a rather dangerous decision had been made for this specific scene. Instead of using fake kids or stunt doubles, director John Landis apparently wanted real children in Morrow's arms for the scene. And mind you, the kids, 6-year-old Renee Chen and 7-year-old Micah Din Lee, were not professional actors, just regular kids excited to be a part of a movie. It was then that disaster struck. These explosions that were going around all over got out of hand and shook the helicopter so violently that it crashed into the river, killing Vic Morrow, Renee, and Micah. A horrific incident may be made worse as it came out with the director yelling, "That's a wrap," as if this was just a normal ending to a scene like the many they had already done. But we will get to that later. First though, let's gloss over some details about the children and what happened. Now, what's maybe the worst part of this accident is that the children's parents, Dr. Daniel Lee and Cheyenne Wei Chen, were there that night, watching in horror as tragedy unfolded right in front of them. And it's also a little heartbreaking that whenever this event is mentioned, people usually talk about Vic Morrow, but when it comes to the kids, Renee and Micah, they're usually reduced to "and the children." But no, they had names, lives, and families, and deserve to be remembered as well. Moving on, however, the fact is the kids weren't supposed to be there that night at all. California law, for example, says children can't work at night without a special permit, and as you might guess, they hadn't gotten one. In fact, their parents were paid under the table in cash to keep things quiet. Also, yet another questionable thing around the scene is that the children's families said they were never told about the helicopter or the explosions, and they had no idea how dangerous the scene would be or could get. Also, and I know I'm going from detail to detail here, but it's because I want you to get the full picture. Turns out the recruitment of the kids wasn't the best approach. Apparently, one of the producers, George Folsey, had reached out to his friend Dr. Harold Schumann, who then contacted his brother Mark Chen about his niece Renee appearing in the scene. Dr. Daniel Lee also thought his son Micah might enjoy being part of the film. So both kids were brought to the set. The director, John Landis, approved them for the scene right away. And that of course came with its share of issues because after the accident, a critical question rose immediately. How many people knew that having the kids there at night was illegal? And as it would turn out, quite a few. Actually, more like everyone but the studio. Warner Brothers, which was the studio behind the movie, remained in the dark because the filmmakers had kept it a secret, afraid that the scene might get shut down. Everyone else, even the executive producer, Frank Marshall, working with Steven Spielberg, knew about the kids and had actually paid their families $500 each for the night's work. No questions asked. And you have to keep in mind that all of this remained unknown until the investigators began to dig. In fact, it seemed the further this case was investigated, the deeper the rot seemed to go. On that note, actually, let's focus on what the evidence said about the crash. For context, some of the most gruesome details about the case only came to light once detectives from the National Transportation Safety Board started retracing what exactly happened, and in order to do that, they had to start from the very beginning. Now, in the world of movie making, people are often split into two groups, above the line and below the line. The above the line folks are the big names, actors, directors, producers, and the below the line group is basically everyone else that works behind the scenes. This includes camera operators, stunt doubles, makeup artists, technicians, you name it, anything behind the scenes. For Twilight Zone the movie, a man named Dan Allingham was in charge of hiring most of these below-the-line workers and was also the first assistant director. With that setup though, and with the background I just gave, one of the crew members, Anderson House, the second assistant director, was worried about having kids on set after hours, especially around a helicopter and explosives. He shared his concerns with Allingham, asking if the director, John Landis, planned to film the kids during the day and make it look like nighttime. Allingham said no. House then asked if Landis had thought about using dummies or small stunt actors instead of real kids. Allingham said Landis didn't want to because he thought it would look fake. When House kept asking about it, Allingham told him to drop it, that there was no point of discussing it any further. Also, just to mention, this was a tightly knit crew. They had sort of come together through recommendations through each other. For example, for the special effects, Allingham had recommended Paul Stewart, who had a great reputation and had already worked with Vic Morrow before. It was then not too surprising that when Landis needed two young Asian children for a scene, he asked George Folsey to find them. And Folsey agreed, even though he wasn't totally comfortable with it. Folsey even joked after a meeting with Landis and Allingham saying, "We'll probably all be thrown in jail for this." They knew hiring kids at night was illegal. And like I said, Folsey reached out to Dr. Harold Schumann for help, who then contacted Dr. Peter Chen. Dr. Chen thought his 6-year-old niece, Renee, would be perfect for the role. When Renee's parents, Mark and Cheyenne Wei, talked to her about being in a movie, little Renee was so excited. She thought it would be a fun experience and something that she could look back on and smile whenever she was older. Next, Dr. Chen reached out to his friend Dr. Daniel Lee, who had a 7-year-old son named Micah. Micah was an outgoing boy who loved having his picture taken. Both were great fits, and even when they met John Landis, the director, he thought they were perfect for the part. Everything seemed set, but they couldn't have been more wrong. On the night of July 22nd, 1982, Renee and Micah were on the set at Indian Dunes Park. It was a quiet, private place with steep cliffs and a shallow river running through it. The movie crew had built a fake Vietnamese village there using bamboo poles, palm leaves, and cardboard. Normal movie stuff. Then, at one point, the helicopter pilot, Dorsey Wingo, apparently had talked to Vic Morrow about the scene. Morrow was supposed to throw a stick at the helicopter as he ran across the river, but Wingo was worried that if the stick hit the helicopter's rotor, it could cause trouble. They decided Morrow could throw a lightweight piece of balsa wood instead. On that same day, it was after 2 a.m. when the children's scene was finally ready to be shot. Both of Renee's parents were there, and Micah's mother, Kim Hoa Lee, was also watching. Landis wanted the kids to look more realistic, so he smeared some mud on their faces and tore their clothes a little to make it seem like they'd been through a lot. As he did so, Vic Morrow tried to keep the kids calm by making funny faces, and the kids couldn't stop laughing. Apparently, he did such a good job at lightening the mood that even when the camera started rolling, they kept giggling. Landis actually had to stop the scene several times and tell them to be serious. Finally, around 3:30 in the morning, Landis got the scene he wanted. The parents were paid $500 in cash, and they were told the kids would be needed again for filming the next night. On the night of July 23rd, 1982, Renee arrived with her mom, and Micah came with his dad. It was the night they were going to film the big scene where Vic Morrow's character Bill carries 2 kids across a river away from a helicopter attack, promising, "I'll keep you safe, kids, I swear to God," as explosions went off behind them in the village. At around 9:30 p.m., before filming that climactic moment, Landis wanted to shoot a scene where Renee and Micah were inside a hut, and Morrow would rush in to grab them and carry them to safety. Landis was directing from a few feet out in the water when a water bomb went off. Dust flew everywhere, and Renee began to cry because it got into her eyes. Renee's mother expressed concern and asked George Folsey if the situation was dangerous. Interestingly, he assured her that it wasn't, describing it as just a loud noise with no real danger. Landis comforted Renee, and then the children and their parents went back to a trailer to rest before their final scene. The first part of that final scene, where the helicopter flew toward the fake village, was filmed at 11:30 p.m. Pilot Dorsey Wingo was in the cockpit with Dan Allingham, who was controlling a spotlight to illuminate the area below. Vic Morrow was standing in the river, and the technicians fired guns to signal the special effects crew to set off explosions. Fire shot up toward the helicopter, and water splashed onto the windshield, making it hard for Wingo to see. He stuck his head out the window, but got burned by the heat and cursed. A fire safety officer, Richard Ebenthewer, saw all that and was worried the helicopter could crash because of the size of the explosions. He told his boss, George Hull, but Hull told him to share his concerns with the filmmakers. He didn't, though. Frustrated, Ebenthewer just shouted, "The helicopter will be on the ground." Actually, in court, he explained why he didn't share his concerns. He told the court that he didn't follow Hull's advice because it wasn't how things were done in the fire department's chain of command. A grave oversight that, as a result, ended up with neither Hull nor Ebenthewer informing the filmmakers about the risks that they had noticed. Anyway, when the helicopter landed, Wingo told Allingham to inform Landis that the explosions were too near to the helicopter. Allingham agreed, emphasizing that safety was the priority. Camera operator Roger Smith, alarmed, also refused to continue filming unless someone ensured that the explosions wouldn't be as close to the helicopter again. Allingham assured him that he would talk to Landis. Later, Allingham told Smith not to worry, saying that Landis had promised the next shot would be safer, with the helicopter flying over the water, filming Vic and the 2 kids. Meanwhile, assistant camera operator Randy Robinson and Wingo talked about how hot the fireball from the explosions had been. Landis overheard them and smiling said, "You ain't seen nothing yet." As all these debates went on, Renee and Micah had fallen asleep in their trailer. So when it was finally time to shoot again, George Folsey woke them up and offered them a snack. Now, to add in here, later when this case was being investigated, both parents recalled that Folsey had instructed them not to let the firefighters know the children were working. He supposedly told them to tell the firemen they were just friends of his, there to help, and not to mention anything about the children or money. And since Cheyenne Wei Chen had limited English, Folsey reportedly asked Dr. Lee to explain it to her. However, Dr. Lee spoke to her in English, as he was Vietnamese and didn't know her language. So, back to the scene. After the kids were up and fed, they went back in. Now as they watched the helicopter head towards the fake village, Cheyenne Chen started to feel nervous and asked Dr. Lee if it was dangerous. Again, just like Dr. Folsey had done, Lee reassured her, saying that George had mentioned it would be scary, but there was no need to worry. Records showed that it was about 2:20 in the morning when John Landis gave the order to start filming. This was after all the concerns that were floating around. For the scene, Vic Morrow walked into the water, which was about knee deep, holding one child under each arm. Then, through his bullhorn, Landis yelled at the helicopter to go lower, and an assistant relayed the order to the pilot using a walkie-talkie. Landis shouted for fire next. Machine gunners Gary McLarty and Kenny Endoso began firing as the helicopter descended. A special effects technician set off water explosions to simulate shots hitting the river. James Chamomile, a quiet technician, was in charge of setting off bigger explosions in the back of the village. He used a firing board, running a nail across it to detonate the bombs. He wore a welder's hood to protect his eyes from the dust. Another technician, Jerry Williams, set off explosions on another side of the village. The heat from the blast was so intense that 2 camera operators had to run up a hill to get away from it. Meanwhile, Wingo realized the aircraft was in trouble. It was hard to control with all the fireballs around. Allingham, who was sitting next to him, noticed the danger too and urged Wingo to get the helicopter out of there. On the ground, James Chamomile, unaware that the helicopter was having trouble, set off 2 more explosions. Somehow, those blasts caused the helicopter to lose control. In the water, Morrow dropped Renee Chen. He tried to grab her, but the helicopter's right skid hit her, killing her instantly. The spinning rotor then struck Vic Morrow, killing him, and also killed 7-year-old Micah, taking his head, a shoulder, and an arm. "That's a wrap," John Landis announced through the loudspeaker, using the usual phrase for the end of filming, but this time the words felt horribly out of place. "Leave your equipment where it is. Everyone go home. Please, everyone go home." Renee's mother and Micah's father were screaming in shock. They were taken to a nearby hospital, treated for shock, and then sent home. There was some protest though, as some of the cast and crew thought that telling everyone to go home right away wasn't the best idea. Script supervisor Catherine Wooten, for instance, later said, according to Faber and Green, "It might have been better if we all stayed together for a while to console each other." Now what's interesting here is not only the reactions from the directors, but also their perspectives, if you could even call it that, during the funerals. George Falsey Jr. and John Landis apparently both wanted to speak at Vic Morrow's funeral, but not everyone thought that was a good idea. Steve Shagan, a close friend of Morrow for example, wasn't happy when they said they wanted to deliver eulogies. Falsey had previewed his speech for Shagan, who was immediately upset. He sarcastically responded, suggesting they should just show the trailer and sell tickets, criticizing the idea of turning the moment into a spectacle. Despite Shagan's objections, both Falsey and Landis went ahead with their speeches at the funeral. Falsey, reflecting on the situation, said that if there was any form of comfort to be found, it was that the film was completed. He emphasized that Vic's final performance should not be forgotten, calling it his last gift to everyone. Landis' eulogy also sounded awkward and self-centered. "Tragedy can strike in an instant," Landis, clearly upset, said, "but film is immortal. Vic lives forever. Just before the last take, Vic took me aside to thank me for the opportunity to play this role." To many, it would have sounded like someone tooting their own horn. But then at Renee Chen's funeral, you could say the mood shifted a bit. Landis showed up looking pale and shaken. He was being held up by his wife and a friend. Renee's relatives stared coldly at him, except for her mother, who was crying. Landis also attended Micah Lee's funeral. Micah's choir, where he used to sing, performed his favorite hymn, "Jesus Loves All Children of the World." There's no doubt that at this point, the accident had affected Landis deeply. Actually, it turned out that for weeks after the tragedy, he was on heavy medication. At one point, he even called his friend and questioned if he was ever going to be able to direct anyone again, even for the simplest instructions. And as bad as the situation had already been, he eventually did. Landis bounced back. Hollywood is a forgiving place, especially if you can make money. In the 4 years between the accident and the trial, Landis returned to directing. And guess what he directed? I'm sure it's something we've all watched. Michael Jackson's Thriller. Yep. There's a crazy random fun fact for you. He also directed Into the Night, where he played a clumsy yet brutal murderer. Some people believe that after such a tragic accident, Landis would be more cautious going forward. Away from that though, needless to say, the families of the victims were devastated and went as far as filing lawsuits. According to the outrageous conduct, Mark and Cheyenne Chen filed suit on August 3, 1982, asking for $200 million in damages and named Landis, Spielberg, George Falsey Jr., Paul Stewart, Dorsey Wingo, Frank Marshall, Warner Brothers, Western Helicopters, the owners of Indian Dunes Park, and a host of other defendants. Micah Lee's family followed with their lawsuit just a little over a year later. Then, in a shocking move facing the $200 million lawsuit, Warner Brothers' lawyers argued that Renee Chen, who was just 6 years old, had, quote, knowingly assumed the risk of being on set. Sometimes I can't help but lawyers are extremely heartless people. Vic Morrow's daughters, Carrie Morrow and actress Jennifer Jason Leigh, also filed a lawsuit against Warner Brothers, Landis, Spielberg, and others. Their case was settled about a year later, but the details were never made public. I think it's safe to assume that the figure could have been somewhere in the millions. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office had to figure out if anyone was criminally responsible for the accident. District Attorney John Van De Kamp put prosecutor Gary Kesselman in charge of the case, with Sergeant Thomas Buds of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department assisting in the investigation. Kesselman, the prosecutor, soon discovered a lot of troubling and confusing things about the accident. When he talked to Donna and Dr. Schumann, they said they didn't know the children they helped recruit would be near explosives or a low-flying helicopter. Cynthia Nye also told him that Landis, Folsey, and Allingham knew they were breaking the law when they hired the kids. To sort of get more information, Kesselman then offered some people involved immunity, meaning they wouldn't be punished for telling the truth. This included Second Assistant Director Anderson House, James Chamomile, who set off the explosives that caused the helicopter crash, and all the special effects crew working under Paul Stewart, but not Stewart himself. House told Kesselman that the children were purposely hidden from Jack Teese, a fire safety officer who sometimes worked as a teacher welfare worker. If Teese had known, he claims he would have reported the illegal hiring. House also said that he warned Dan Allingham about the risks to the kids. At the grand jury hearings, Paul Stewart and Dorsey Wingo refused to answer questions, using their Fifth Amendment right to avoid incriminating themselves. Folsey, however, testified and admitted that, quote, in retrospect, he would have filmed the helicopter and the actor with the children at different times. When John Landis testified, he basically blamed everyone else for the tragedy. He said he assumed Stewart and Wingo, the experts, had coordinated everything. Kesselman pressed him further though, questioning why Landis hadn't ensured the experts communicated with each other. And to this, Landis responded by comparing the situation to taking a taxi, saying that when you get into a cab, you trust a driver won't drive you off a bridge because they're a licensed professional. Similarly, the experts on set were trusted to do their jobs. Later, Kesselman steered the questioning to a different direction, asking about who held the final authority regarding camera positions, actors, the helicopter, and other aspects on set. Landis still denied wrongdoing, quickly interrupting and stating that the final authority was not his. He added that if he told an actor to put their hand in a garbage disposal, the actor would naturally refuse, emphasizing that it wasn't his responsibility to make such decisions. Another tidbit here is that during the trial, Wingo said that he regretted that actor Vic Morrow didn't look up at the helicopter, as he supposedly told him to. I don't know how you could regret someone else's actions, but it's what he said. He claimed Morrow had, quote, over 5 seconds between the time that the sound of the helicopter changed and the impact, but he did later say he wasn't trying to blame Morrow. However, D'Agostino was quick to criticize this, asking how Wingo expected Morrow to look up when he was carrying 2 kids standing in water with a helicopter just 24 feet above his head. She said, Morrow was carrying the 2 youngsters in his arms while standing almost knee-deep in water as the helicopter, which had been hovering at 24 feet, spun toward him. D'Agostino called Wingo's comments quite amazing and questioned how Wingo could think that Morrow could escape. She also said, they're blaming the parents, they're blaming the fire safety officers, they're out here blaming everyone. Now they're blaming the dead man. It's incredible. On June 15, 1983, the grand jury returned its verdict. Landis, Foley, and Allingham were charged with 2 counts of manslaughter for the deaths of Renee Chen and Micah Lee. The charges were based on the idea that if someone dies while an unlawful and dangerous act is happening, it counts as manslaughter. In this case, the illegal hiring of the children was the unlawful act. Landis, Stewart, and Wingo were also charged with 3 counts of manslaughter for reckless and negligent acts that led to the deaths of Morrow and the children. However, as all this went down, Kesselman later came to admit that he made a decision that he would regret. He didn't charge Landis, Folsey, and Allingham for the illegal hiring of the children or for hiring them past curfew. He explained that if he had charged them with these minor crimes, the jury could have found it easier to convict them of those instead of the more serious manslaughter charges. Meanwhile, Twilight Zone the movie opened in theaters on June 24, 1983, but the reviews were mostly bad. Critics felt it lacked the creativity that made the TV show special. Landis' segment was especially criticized. Time critic Richard Carless wrote, "The story hardly looks worth shooting, let alone dying for. If that doesn't sting, I don't know what does." The film didn't show anything of Renee Chen or Micah Lee, and Landis' segment played out almost as he originally wrote it, where a bigot gets magical punishment. As for the case, in January of 1984, the lawyers for all 5 defendants requested that the charges be dismissed. Landis' attorney, Harlan Braun, called Landis an artist and said his segment was, quote, a cinematographic statement against racism and bigotry. Braun also gave a strange reason for casting the children, saying children are classically used in films to evoke emotion in an audience because adults generally don't like one another, but everyone likes children. What? Now, I know I didn't go deep into the court hearings, including the testimonies, but they went down just how you'd expect. Renee Chen's mother, Cheyenne Chen, for example, testified through an interpreter. She cried as she described the heartbreaking moment she watched her daughter die. After the testimony, Landis told a reporter, "This is a terrible, terrible accident, and it will cause pain and anguish to all of us for the rest of our lives. The idea that this could be anything other than a foreseeable accident is not only wrong, it's bewildering." On the other hand, the casting director, Marcy Liroff, also testified. saying that she had warned Landis that hiring the children was illegal and that the scene, quote, sounded kind of dangerous. She claimed that Landis, Folsey, and Allingham said they were going to hire the kids anyway. Then elsewhere, Braun, Landis' lawyer, tried to argue that the cause of the helicopter crash was unclear. While the prosecution said the explosion's debris caused it, Braun brought in experts who thought heat delamination, or the weakening of the helicopter's blades from the heat, was to blame. However, Kesselman argued that the exact cause didn't matter since the helicopter was flown recklessly close to the explosions. On April 23, 1984, Judge Crahan dismissed the manslaughter charges against Folsey and Allingham, saying there wasn't enough evidence, but he upheld the charges against Landis, Stewart, and Wingo. The judge said that Landis went beyond simple direction and helped set up the dangerous situation. Stewart, as the special effects coordinator, and Wingo, the helicopter pilot, were both held responsible for knowingly creating a risky situation. Later, both sides appealed the judge's decisions. Eventually, all charges were reinstated against Folsey and Allingham, and the charges against Landis, Stewart, and Wingo were upheld. Also, an interesting fact that I came across is that before the trial started, Landis apparently switched lawyers. He replaced Braun with James Neal, a respected lawyer known for his work in high-profile cases. Neal had defended the Ford Motor Company in the exploding Pinto case and had won a not guilty verdict for Elvis Presley's doctor. And somewhere along, the prosecution also made changes. Kesselman, despite what you'd call his outstanding work in the case, was taken off because of negative attention involving a dance hall he owned, where some hostesses had been arrested for inappropriate behavior. His replacement was Leah Perwin D'Agostino, and she was definitely one of those lawyers you wouldn't forget. People called her the Dragon Lady, or sometimes even Queen Leia, because she was quite tough and was always ready to fight hard in the courtroom. I mean, she wasn't just confident, she was known for being aggressive, with a long history of winning cases, and the defense lawyers didn't get along with her at all. It seemed like there could have been some elements of sexism behind how the defense felt about her, sort of the fact that D'Agostino wasn't part of their old boys club, and was bold, assertive, and not afraid to speak her mind. Now, all that said, we might as well gloss over the jury. 7 women and 5 men, with about a third of them being people of color, Asian, Black, or Hispanic. They came from all sorts of jobs. There were 2 homemakers, a person who repaired pallets, a chemist, a clerk typist, and the judge on the case was Roger Boren, who had once been the prosecutor in the famous case of the Hillside Stranglings. Now, following this accident, things changed. The movie industry changed its safety practices. Warner Brothers created safety committees to establish rules for things like pyrotechnics, gunfire, and even smoke on movie sets. The Directors Guild also started punishing directors who broke safety rules and set up hotlines to answer safety questions quickly. Because of these changes, accidents on movie sets apparently dropped by 69.6% between 1982 and 1986, but unfortunately 6 deaths still happened. Also, a year later in 1987, the State Fire Marshal's Office in California set up the Motion Picture and Entertainment Safety Program, which oversaw the use of special effects like explosions on film sets in the state. Now, regarding this specific film, the director, John Landis, said in a 1996 interview, there was absolutely no good aspect about this whole story. The tragedy, which I think about every day, had an enormous impact on my career, from which I may possibly never recover. Steven Spielberg, who co-produced it, was deeply affected too. He ended his friendship with Landis and said the accident left everyone, quote, sick to the center of our souls, and added, no movie is worth dying for. Then the assistant director, Andy House, had his name removed from the credits. He replaced it with a fake name, Alan Smithy. This was the first time a director had been charged due to a fatality on a film set. A truly horrible case overall, with clearly long-lasting impact. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. If you liked the video, make sure to leave a like. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. And I do want to acknowledge something very quick. I do have a face tattoo. I do have a tattoo on my face. I got it red ink. It's R squared. I'm not really going to explain the meaning of it. It's just for me, even though everyone's going to see it. But still, I just didn't think it would be appropriate to say it at the beginning of the video and then get into that dark topic. I know there's going to be a bunch of questions about it, but yes, this is me acknowledging it. We can move on now. But yeah, that's really it for this one. I will see you guys next time I upload.